Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining today's BritCham webinar on food resilience. I'm Lorena Paglia and I'm the chairperson of BritCham Sustainability Committee. Today, we bring this event to you together with the Sustainability, Built Environment and Transport, Logistics and Supply Chain Committees. Sustainability is everyone's problem to solve. No one individual, company, government or community can solve this on their own. And it's in this spirit that the Chamber's Sustainability Committee come together as a diverse group of companies and individuals who bring subject matter and cross-industry expertise to share and create the much needed sustainability dialogue with our members. And this is where the Chamber's Race to Net Zero campaign comes in. The Race to Net Zero is about creating a world that we want to prosper and live in. It's a campaign to rally leadership and support businesses, cities, regions, investors for a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery. And in doing so, we're able to contribute to prevent further threats, build innovation and enable inclusive, sustainable growth. And we invite everybody to head over to our website to understand the further details around the Race to Net Zero. But then this also brings us to the event and the webinar that we're all here for today. Our joint committees are excited to bring this webinar to you in exploring how COVID-19 has impacted global food security and supply chains, and in some areas created further food insecurity. We've seen of our experiences over this past year is the pandemic has triggered panic buying, stockpiling, and food protectionism, exposing an over-reliance on highly efficient supply chains. And the reality for climate change is that it will result in more frequent episodes of extreme weather conditions and will cause further disruption to our food sources value chains. And part of our recent global experiences is it's demonstrated the need to transition to a new sustainable and resilient healthy food system. But to be able to do this requires research, innovation and growth. And we have seen also a shift towards this as part of the Singapore Government Green 2030 plan. Our session today with our esteemed panelists focus on these topics and the opportunity to leading the way in innovation, and in securing a sustainable food supply for the future. On that note, I will hand over to Chin Tan, who is our moderator for this event, and will introduce our guests to kick off today's session.
Thanks, Lorena. That's great. Thanks again. Hi all. So I'm Chin Tan. I'm based in Singapore, and I'm an architect and an urban designer by profession. And I work with Arab, and most of my work is around. In the last 2 years, have been focused on what food does to cities. So I work a lot in the cities arena. So I'm hoping to get really nice conversation going amongst three really interesting panelists out here and very diverse in nature. So we're going to start Helena Wright, who is the policy director at Fairer Institute. She's based in London, and where she focuses on policy solutions. And we'll get to know more about that in the next hour. Next is Bjorn, who is an executive director and co-founder at the Edible Garden City, and he's based in. His work is based in Singapore, but he's a traveler between Melbourne and Singapore, as far as I know him well. And I don't know where he is right now. and the third is Bee here. She is the Chief Executive Officer at Food from the Heart, also based in Singapore. And it's a non-governmental organization and not for profit as well. So with that, I'm going to ask Helena to take the stage and give her thoughts on this topic. And Helena, over to you.
Thank you. Great to be here today. My name is Helena Wright and I'm the Policy Director at FAIR. We are an investor network with over 38 trillion of investors supporting that network now. And our research mainly focuses on the ESG risks and opportunities in the protein supply chain. And when we looked 5 years ago, this was quite an emerging space. Since then, we've grown to be actually one of the world's fastest growing investor networks, focusing on ESG risks in the global food sector. And what we found through our research is that under our climate risk tool, climate change is going to have major effects on this sector. But the producers with a portfolio that is diversified more into sustainable protein are going to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. both in terms of the physical impacts of climate change and also the transition risks as we move to a net zero world. And I would also like to touch on another point here, which is that our resilience is not only to climate change, there's many other sustainability risks and also systemic risks in our food system. One being the COVID crisis that we see at the moment, which is an example. So pandemic risk is a really important risk we have to face, and that is linked to a number of other risks, as you know. And our pandemic ranking index actually found that more than 70% of animal agriculture firms are at high risk of fostering new zoonotic diseases. So Singapore, it's really great to be here on this panel because Singapore has done some really exciting things actually as a city, including the streamlining of regulation to cultured meat. There's a great potential for Singapore to become a producer in these new types of food technology. And that could address some of the issues Singapore has with food security. For example, the fact that 90% of food is imported. So just to sum up here, I think there's a big opportunity here for leaders in new technologies and new ways of producing food that's more sustainable to actually increase the resilience of our food system, as well as reduce a lot of other really systemic risks such as climate change risk, biodiversity risk, antibiotic risk, and pandemic risk. I'll stop there, but it's really great to be here today.
Thanks, Helena. That is great. And the index is something I'm really keen to know more about. That's really interesting where you're going with that. That was great, Helena. And with that, I'm going to invite Bjorn to give us some very very down-to-earth conversation, because you literally are working physically as a farmer in Singapore. So over to you, Bjorn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to speak. So my practice is based in Singapore. We've been an urban farming social enterprise for the last 8 years. So I just want to quickly share a little bit of our work. Everyone can see the slides, all right? So we build and design and maintain urban farms in Singapore using 3 core philosophies: so sustainability, creating environmental impact, and community engagement. A lot of times the work that we do, we use philosophies that are more regenerative in approaches, for example, food foresting. And you can see when these principles are applied on spaces that are previously uncultivated, you start to create biodiverse food production spaces. We also work on activating underutilized spaces, for example, like in the viaducts, in shop houses. What we see is once we create the space, you create actually a community of people wanting to address the food system. But really, what is the big disconnect between Singaporeans and food is just the knowledge of growing. We're really disconnected from agriculture because it's such a non-existent industry in the past. Our work also transgress into students and also young children as well, building environmental ethics and environmental responsibility frameworks in schools. We also work with the beneficiaries and special needs individual as part of our team, working as part of our team. And what we've seen is actually moving into the elderly market, trying to activate that space. The evidence that we have curated and created over the years is that using horticulture therapy and care farming as a intervention to actually allow urban farms to not only produce food, but also as a place of care and for mental wellness as well. I just want to share a last quote. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but really the cultivation and perfection of human beings. And this is from Masanobu Fukuoka. So I'll end my sharing here, and back to you, Chintan.
Well, this really takes me to the fact that there's so much more to food than food in itself. Food is just an entry point to various aspects of our living. And the way we bring communities together and the way we design our cities, in my case. With that, Be here, over to you, because I'm sure you're going to bring a very fresh perspective on this aspect as well.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I think I have to get Sabina to share the slides. Yes. Food from the Heart is a food charity. It started 18 years ago, since 2003. It was started by an Austrian couple, Christine and Henry Leimer. They read a newspaper article about businesses, bakeries throwing bread at the end of a business day. And they decided to gather their friends together to collect unsold bread and redistribute it out to the needy and the poor. So the mission of Food from the Heart is primarily to alleviate hunger by providing the three keywords is really about reliable, consistent, and sustainable food support to the less fortunate through food distribution programs. So there's two pillars that we do, which is primarily feeding the hungry, needy, and also minimizing food waste. Next, please. Sabina, yes. So our footprint in Singapore, we work with school partners, we work with community food pack partners all over the island. We work with bakeries to collect bread, hotels as well. We also support welfare homes. So last year, being a pandemic year, we actually fed more than 53,000 beneficiaries in Singapore, distributed $6.35 million worth of food. We packed more than 1.4 million food items, saved almost 200,000 kg of bread from 115 bakeries. We serve about 129 distribution points, and we support more than 100 welfare homes. So that gives you a gist of what we do, the scale of what we do. We're primarily like a logistics company. And the next slide. I would want to leave some questions for our guests to really ponder. What guides us as a food charity? And I think these are questions relevant to everyone today as we talk about food security and sustainability. What is food security to the needy? How different is that from all of us? Is feeding the needy the solution to minimizing food waste? And what is a livable city to the needy? As compared to as governments try to create livable cities, we have found out from the needy that their livable space is primarily the nearest market, the nearest food center, the nearest clinic, the nearest government agencies that they have to deal with. So we also hope that you can also think about how do we donate right to give better. And within the food charity space, we also have our own supply chain, so to speak. And if you look at the chain below, it's really about raising funds, raising food. We raise funds to buy food. We also raise food donations in kind. How do we then get volunteers to check, sort, and pack? How do we deliver that to the distribution partners? From distribution partners, which is run by volunteers, and then how does the beneficiaries get the food? That is our supply chain for food support. And it is different, very different from the supply chain that everyone is talking about. But during COVID, this supply chain was also affected, and how digital solutions can help us. That's the end of my presentation. I'll leave you more questions with answers.
Thanks, Pia. It just highlights that how the entry points of all three of you have been quite different and very specific as well. And that's why I'm really looking forward to the question and answer. So audience, please feel free to add in questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can take some of your questions as well. But meanwhile, since I'm the moderator, I get the opportunity to ask the first few questions, and I'll start with that. So my questions are to all three of you, and you can probably respond in what you think works for you, or where you could reflect more onto or best onto that. The first one is very Singapore specific, and I think, Helena, it'll be great to know if you wanted to go beyond or you want to highlight something more differently than that, please feel free to do so, because something's very topical right now in Singapore, and that is the Green Plan 2030 that's been announced. And every industry in Singapore is looking at what does that mean to themselves, the Singapore Green Plan 2030. And for most of you would know that, but the people who don't, Singapore's announced a Green Plan for 2030. So there are quite a few initiatives that Singapore wants to push towards achieving more low carbon or green initiatives, and want to reach at a certain point by 2030. Food, of course, plays a very important role in this conversation. So based on that, my question is, what does the Singapore Green Plan 2030 mean to you? So probably I'll start with B here first, and probably you go B here, and then we move on the other way.
Thank you, Chintan. 3030 for planners, sustainable living, is really quite different for the needy. What is 3030 to the needy? I don't think they fully understood for some of them. For us as a food charity, I would prefer a number that's a little bit different. It's more like 90 by 30. Why 90? 1 meal a day, 3 meals a day for 30 days, every day. And that would be 90 meals for every day. The 30 to me would be more the number of days. It's not in terms of, the metric is kind of different. And for us, it's really about when we feed the needy, we look at giving them the dignity of choice. We are not looking at, what you want to throw away and you collect that. We have a bit of that, but we actually don't do everything on that. So we look at the source, we look at the needs, we identify that, we try to target that, and then we try to use technology to also help us. Over back to you, Chintan. Chintan, you're muted.
Of course, there has to be someone who has to be, it has to go through this, that you're on mute. Thanks, B here. Bjorn, what do you think?
Well, I think this whole initiative is great. Probably has had to happen 10 years ago, seeing the situation we are in right now. I think it's a very bold step when Singapore Food Agency announced the producing 30% of nutritional needs by 2030. I think it's a massive effort to actually get to that point, because we are still today at 10%, and less than 1% of our land is actually being cultivated. So it requires really innovative solutions to come in. Of course, we've seen huge push from the government to put in technologically advanced infrastructure, re-tendering out agriculture lands and setting new targets for new farmers to come in, with huge quantums for investments required to actually set up these farms. And though there's still challenges in this space, because land tenure is still quite short, right? Because Singapore is quite land stressed. So 30 years, it's still very hard to make a business case for a lot of these farmers. So I think during this next 10 years, there's going to be huge shifts around in the industry. So only those that will be able to sort of create a sustainable business model would prevail, and the rest will probably have to kind of struggle along the way. I think we need to look at multifaceted solutions. So technology is great as an enabler. It shouldn't be a silver bullet solution. And so perhaps a whole society effort to growing food needs to be sort of advocated a lot more as well. But so this green plan actually sort of ties everything together as a whole of society approach to sustainability, whether it's food growing or cutting carbon and stuff. So it's a great move and a bold move. Back to you, Chintan.
Thanks, Bjorn. Yeah, I indeed think it is a bold move, and it'll be very, very interesting to see how we go for the go on for the next 9 years now to get to that point. Helena, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just to pick up on what Bjorn just said, I think this is a great opportunity for innovation, for Singapore to really get ahead in really innovative technologies, and also to potentially become a kind of exporter for create jobs as well as trade opportunities. Actually, Singapore became, as you know, the first country to improve cultured meat recently at the end of last year for sale, which was quite an exciting milestone. There's a few other countries around the world that are innovating, but Singapore is definitely one of the leaders of this. And one interesting point to note is, cultured meat would have significantly lower emissions. It's predicted to have at least around 80% lower emissions, 80 to 90% lower emissions, much lower water use, much lower land use. So there's all these types of benefits. 99% lower land use compared to animal protein production in a conventional way, according to one study that came out recently. And this is expected to be a multi-billion-pound market as well. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to be made if the innovation carries on in the way it is now. I'd also say that, you know, this is only one of a number of different technologies that are being pursued. There's also fermentation technologies, etc. So I think there's a really exciting kind of food revolution that's underway here. A lot of investors getting very interested in the food innovation space as well. So overall, it is a very stretching target that has been set of 30 by 30. But I think there's so many opportunities for that target to spur a lot of innovation.
Thanks, Helena. I think, yeah, I'm really keen to see how or when cultured meat becomes economically, but also environmentally sustainable to complete all extent, including energy use, etc. A small anecdote is that I turned vegetarian 2.5 years back, and now my friends are asking me, the day cultured meat becomes environmentally aptly sustainable, would you go back to having meat? And I don't have the answer right now, but probably. Because I became vegetarian purely for environmental reasons. But actually, good points, Helena, on the whole technology part, because that's kind of bringing me to the next question, which is, and that goes to all three of you again, but especially Bjorn, because you've been working in as a farmer, urban farmer in Singapore, and probably may also connect to the question I see Philip Jackson has asked, the second one around vertical farms. So the question is, how is digitization and technology changing the idea of food production, distribution, and consumption in our cities, especially? So for example, I mean, Helena pointed out, Bjorn, you have strong views on that, I know, around hydroponics, lab meat, high-tech farming, etc. Is that truly sustainable? And if not, can it ever become? So why don't I start with you, Bjorn? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I have quite a lot to say about this, as Chintan has mentioned. We have indoor farms, vertical farms, growing cold weather gap crops for restaurants. You know, up to 60 restaurants in Singapore that we distribute to. In a lot of sense, we were actually trying to solve a logistic issue because a lot of these crops in the past, like microgreens and edible flowers, were imported from Holland. And we were trying to sort of grow them locally in hope to actually reduce the carbon miles of or carbon footprint of these produce. But the fact is, the energy usage of such farms, whether it's for cooling and lighting, climate control, actually far outweighs the benefits. So I think that there's been recently a study from Oxford University, measuring different methodologies of controlled environment agriculture, and they found that actually it's quite resource intensive. Of course, when we're able to start to shift all of these into using renewable energy, then there is probably a more sustainable footprint for the future. But at this stage, it's actually very resource intensive to run these farms. While if you look at the amount of space that we have, there are currently sort of landscape in gardens. These could be sort of the foundation of other natural farming practices to that can grow food for the community as well. So yeah, I think it is necessary for the future to really address some of the gaps that we have, but it shouldn't be a silver bullet solution to food security for Singapore. Back to you, Chintan.
Thanks, Bjorn. Yeah, I appreciate that response as well. I'll come back to you, Helena. Helena, you of course highlighted and you touched upon this part, and a huge part of your the work that you do is connected to this. So anything specific that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, actually, just one point that was already mentioned earlier is the kind of energy intensity that you mentioned of some of these processes. Cultured meat at the moment is a very energy intensive process. Obviously less energy intensive than the conventionally produced meat, but still quite intensive. One important aspect would be the development of renewable energy for the production process, and that could really offset some of those high energy costs as well. And actually one recent study found that the use of renewable energy could cut the carbon footprint of the cultivated meat industry by 80%. So I think that's a very interesting paired kind of strategy to consider to help make these new technologies more sustainable. And another quick issue to mention is also the growth medium. So it's quite a new technology, and there's a growth medium at the moment. A lot of the tech companies are using a fetal bovine serum as a medium, but the industry is trying to replace this with cheaper and plant-based ingredients. So I think there's further steps to be taken, definitely, to make these kind of cultured meat technologies more sustainable, but there is huge potential for that to be in the end sustainable. Another quick thing to mention would obviously be that it's important to consider this in the context of healthy diets as well, and more sustainable diets. There may not be enough resources totally, even if we move to cultured meat, to have that in every single meal, if you see what I mean. So people still need to think about having a holistic, healthy diet. That's more from a kind of health perspective.
In terms of health and individuals, I think it would be interesting to think about where do you think technology plays a role, or digitization for that matter, in what you do in feeding the needy?
I think there are two parts to it. I think what Helena has said about nutrition is always on top of our mind. Currently, we look at canned food, we look at instant noodles, because that's what's available in the market at that kind of price. But we are fully aware that if technology can bring us to a better place with more economical pricing, but more nutritious meals that can last us 3 to 4 weeks, and that would really help to change the entire landscape. So that's the technology part of it. Digitalization, we have embarked on the digitalization journey for the last 2 to 3 years, accelerated very much by COVID. So now we actually make use of QR coded beneficiary cards. We do use it as a means to collect data from our beneficiaries, and we know what they want to take, what they prefer, the timing, the habits, the consumption, the taste. And using digitalization, we have also given them the power of choice, the dignity of choice, through 2 new initiatives we pushed out last year. One is Community Shop, where it is a shop for free concept. It is just like a shop, a mini mart, and the beneficiaries can go in, collect what they want from the shelves. The food are donated, and regardless of brand, regardless of size, regardless of type of food, they can just choose what they want. The other one is Project Belanja. Belanja is a Malay word for giving you a treat, a meal, and that's the exact sense of the project, where we work with participating hawkers. In Singapore, it's food paradise. You just go downstairs, you just walk a few steps, you're able to reach a food center, a coffee shop. It is all inbuilt within the community. And what we wanted to do using technology and digitalization is to provide seamless food support that the needy can just ask for in the most simple manner, and they can just go within the community to get access to warm meals. So there's no need for a soup kitchen and all that. So everything is simplified in that manner, and the system digitalization also allow us to have a sort of an alarm system. If the needy doesn't come and collect the meal, we're aware. The partners will go knocking on the doors to find out how they are, or are they hospitalized. So we are maximizing a lot on digitalization and technology, and that will drive us for the next few years. Based on the data we collect, we can share that with the general public so that people can donate right, and then we can give better.
Thanks. That's a very, very interesting perspective about the canned food technology and nutrition coming together. So no, thanks for that. I think that leads me to the next question, and that's because I think here you spoke about community and people coming together. What is the role, and Bjorn, you're a farmer already, so what is the role of a farmer in the future of food production? And in other words, can the community become farmers? So how can we bring everyone together on this journey? Yeah, Bjorn, please.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that there have already been concepts developed in the past, right? Whether it's agrarian urbanism, where it's a whole society effort to food growing, integrating food production into urban planning, and how we design cities. And these are sort of solutions and ideas that can actually encourage people to grow food. I think Singapore itself has already a strong foundation of community gardens. We have 1,200 at last count. So these are potentially decentralized farming, community farming spots that could produce food. Of course, we need to, at least the government needs to start looking at policies to allow these spaces to be able to grow and sell food. Currently, they can't actually sell the produce that they grow due to food safety concerns or other legislation, but they are looking at that, and that will create a whole new sort of supply chain with small decentralized farms. I think that there has been quite a bit of work done in Europe where farmers are not only now seen as people that are producing food, but also as environmental stewards. So if they keep their landscape like 100 acres of farmland in a biodiverse, in a very sustainably farmed way, they actually get credits back from the EU, for example. So those are models that are new and should be also kind of adopted globally as to change the roles of farmers, not just as a food producer, but also as a protector of the environment. Back to you, Chintan.
Thanks, Bjorn. Be here, Helena, would you like to add something on this one?
I think in the space of the needy, we have got partners who are managing some of the community gardens, and they harvest it and they actually then distribute that to within the community, those in need. So that is really about nutritious food, fresh, and within the community. So that is something that is the needy is also benefiting from this initiative as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the point about farmers as well, and point out that a lot of the new technologies may, need and require new kind of skill sets, and there's a high job creation potential as well for shifting towards new food production technologies. I think there's a role for the universities and schools to help to create the right skill sets for the new generation of farmers and kind of generate interest in new kind of greener jobs as well. It's not so relevant for Singapore, but there is a global discussion about, how their stranded assets may be created in the traditional livestock sector. And for that, there's finance needed to help farmers transition from an old way of producing food to newer technologies and new opportunities. Just to also touch on the topic of the needy and how to feed people as well. I think one important point to note is that today we're basically feeding about 1 billion tons of grain to feed livestock only. With that same grain, we could actually directly feed 3.5 billion people. So there's a huge opportunity here to have more food and better food security globally by shifting away from just feeding directly our food to livestock.
That number is astonishing. Absolutely spot on. I have a few more questions, but I think there's some really nice questions that come up in the Q&A. So probably I'm going to take up one or two of them if I go back to my list if I need to. I think there's one on planning and zoning by Phil Jackson, and that probably may touch to a few of you on this panel. So it says, to what extent is food security affected by planning/zoning by local authorities? Should there be a change in allocation of appropriated land in any locality to make space available to food supply and distribution? Bjorn, you want to go with this one?
Yeah. Though you are the urban planner, right, Chintan? Well, I guess the challenge that a lot of sort of farm land, because land is quite a premium in Singapore, and rezoning happens quite often, and so farmland is, as I mentioned previously, the tenure terms are quite short, so it is sometimes quite challenging for farms to invest for the future. And when we talk about urban farms, the tenure terms are even shorter. So it's a 9 years maximum. So it's really hard to invest and plan for food production in the city. Currently, there is, Singapore is a garden city, or city in the garden. That policy-wise, which drives developers to develop landscape to replace areas, the landscape replacement area, actually has created a boom in the landscaping industries for vertical green walls, rooftop gardens. We just need to kind of think a little bit more purposeful on how we use those landscapes. If we are able to kind of plant food plants in those, perhaps then we are kind of, in a way, increasing the amount of arable land just by changing a policy simply. And we can start to measure this, right? We can start to measure the landscape with a nutritional index instead of a green index. How much nutrition can this plot of landscape produce? If you plant sweet potatoes, for example, which thrives in our tropical climate, and just leave it to grow because you don't really need to manage it, then you have tons of carbohydrates, just sitting there, waiting to be harvested. So I guess, yeah, it's just a different take on how we can approach this, just a low-hanging fruit, if and just switch that and pluck that out. Yeah, back to you, Chintan.
Be here, Helena. Would you have anything more to add on this? But food in urban areas, I think that's where probably more the question is, when you want to change land rights or policies.
I think in Singapore, it's really about competing needs because it's just so small. So that is always a challenge, whether, in terms of land usage, there's always, I'm sure the policymakers are torn apart in what is the priority. So I think that is something that will always be at the back of the mind of every Singaporean, because we're aware how small the island is. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Pia. Yeah, Helena.
Yeah, I think there's just a potential for kind of more thinking around this. I used to I was living in Singapore last year actually, and there's quite an interesting question in the chat box here from an anonymous person. Will end parks allow people to pick the edible fruits from the green spaces? That's an interesting question, where there might be some potential for partnerships between public and private sector maybe, or some innovative thinking around enabling people to do that in certain areas, which could make a good use of land. Just some kind of anecdotal thoughts.
No, thanks for that. I'm going to take one question from here, which is Sarah, and that's to do with waste, because we haven't yet properly touched on that and technology, etc. So she says, whilst it's great that there has been a lot of advances in food tech to advance Singapore's 30 by 30 goal, is food waste, which currently accounts for 11% of total waste in Singapore, the elephant in the room. How can we better reduce this? And I guess that waste issue is not just Singapore specific. I guess it's everywhere. So it would be great. Who would like to take that first?
Maybe I'll take that first.
Yeah.
Food from the Heart started off collecting bread, surplus unsold bread that would have gone to the bin. We also work with the supermarket chains to collect dented packaging, damaged items that cannot be sold. and we bring it back to the warehouse, we check, we sort it out, and it goes out to somebody in need. It will land up on somebody's table as their meals. So in terms of food, minimizing food waste, it is something that is very real. So for us, we actually conduct a clean plate campaign from July to October every year, and we target the youngsters, the next generation youngsters, to finish their food on their plate in school, and we get them to bring back the message home. The campaign is gathering movement. Last year in COVID, we counted 146,000 clean plates, and we'll try to link that back to once they save the food, a donor comes in to donate money for every clean plate, and it helps us to also feed the needy. So we do connect the messages together so that people can understand better about finishing everything on the plate. And really, we pose the questions, do you really need an upsize? So we also work with storeholders as well. Yeah, so that's what we do at our end. I think there was also a question about individually, what can all of us do as an individual to be responsible for what we do? I think we can just start off by finishing everything on our plate.
Yeah, that's a good message and a very simple message. Yeah,
I can jump in. Yeah. So I guess the elephant in the room for food waste is really in the supply chain, in the food supply chain. We've heard of instances where food imports, like a whole container of avocado comes from New Zealand. They batch test it, it fails. The whole container is dumped. So these are things that we don't even see. Where they dump it to, we don't know. So there is a need to kind of look at the nutrient sink that Singapore is creating, because you're essentially taking fertility from all around the world and dumping it into Singapore. So whether we can then be a net exporter of fertility to the region by capturing this waste and turning it back into fertility. One of the projects that we've worked on is using black soldier fly to actually compost pre-consumer food waste. So a lot of industrial food waste, mainly sort of soybean pulp and beer waste, brewery waste, and these are fed to the insects. They then produce animal feed and also organic fertilizer, but also biomaterials that can be exploited for industrial application. So yeah, we just need to kind of rethink the whole idea that looking at Singapore as a living organism, and recapturing the waste streams, creating fertility, feeding that back into our urban farms, and then exporting the fertility back to the agriculture nations to support regenerative practice for the future. Back to you, Chintan.
Thanks, Bjorn. Helena, in all your the funding and financing of food, where does waste play that role?
I think there's a really important role, I think as already mentioned, of the retailers, supermarkets, etc., into helping actually avoid waste. And we have an index that looks across a wide variety of factors. Actually, we look at more the sort of a different end of the waste, which is the kind of producer waste rather than the retail manufacturing waste. But I think this is all part of a good ESG management and actually the wide range of ESG factors that retailers might integrate to have good governance in their systems. So I also think there's an important role for the investors here, which is something FAIR is obviously doing, which is where investors are investing in a particular retailer or a supermarket chain, they can actually call on them to improve their ESG performance and their governance. And that's the kind of really way to help to reduce emissions as well.
Thanks, because I think your point, and also Bjorn, you highlighted earlier, there's another question there which is around the fact that to grow a kilo of fish in Singapore, we need to bring a feed for about the same weight. And then what are we doing about recycling food-based biomass? So I think quite a few of the conversation here is already connected to that, but it is astonishing how if you start connecting and make a much more circular, connected ecosystem, you probably will just resolve quite a few aspects, but everyone's working in a very individual way. But the question then is, who takes that responsibility of bringing everyone together and connecting that cycle and making it circular? And that is still a question. You don't have to answer, but that's still a question in my mind. And probably that's where we planners need to come and work with the government top down or coming up with the circularity of food ecosystem in that place. And working with the right agencies. There is one question, and I think we have all answered quite a bit on that one. But I would just make it much more of as a global question. And that is, how do we secure food for the needy? And I think, Bihya, you've highlighted that quite a few times in different ways. But I want to also understand this from the financing point of view, but also beyond, from your point of view of production, of how, even if it comes to high tech, and Helena, you can come in there as well, how do we create an equitable system of food distribution and production in the world? And please, whoever wants to mute first and answer.
I can give it a stab. I guess I think food poverty and food justice are both major issues globally. And when we look at the current food system, it is very neoliberal in its approach, right? It's owned by major corporations. A few people are pulling the strings. I think to have a very equitable food system, we need to return power back to small producers globally. So the whole food sovereignty movement globally has been really important in this space, and giving a voice to indigenous communities producing food for local communities is very crucial and key. We've seen also the role urban farms play in food deserts in the US, for example, in Detroit, where food accessibility for racial groups are limited, right? So therefore, they fall in this continued cycle of poverty and malnutrition because of the choices and availability that they have. So urban farms then play that role in ensuring a more equitable food system by providing nutritionally dense food to these communities. So we just need to really look back at changing the centralized corporate dominant food systems into decentralized community-owned systems as an alternative strategy. I'm not saying that corporate systems are bad. We just need a multifaceted approach to this very complex food system issue. Back to you, Chintan.
Thanks for that. Helena?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point when we're talking about food justice and food security. At the moment, the current policies and the system that we have are primarily focused on feeding livestock and animals rather than feeding people. Because we know that basically, even though animal protein only represents 20% of the world's calories, is using up more than 70% of the land globally. And really the rate at which this animal production actually converts feed into food is really low. We know that the animals are consuming more food than they actually produce. One interesting thing to mention might be the role of subsidies in this, and the current subsidies that we have. This is not so relevant to Singapore, but also more globally, really supporting just the current system as it is and prioritizing livestock production. It was estimated by Greenpeace that more than 70% of the EU subsidies goes to livestock, for example. And a group of investors actually recently called on the EU to reform its agricultural subsidies in line with climate change and with nature goals. And more than 2 trillion of investors actually supported that statement. And it's all actually being negotiated next week. So we'll see whether some of these subsidies eventually do get reformed in a way that's more equitable and that better supports food security.
That's very interesting. Yeah, be here. Sorry.
Yes, just like you mentioned about who's responsible for creating that system. So I would just want to add on a little bit to that, is that when we give when we try to feed the needy indiscriminately, without plans, without organizing it, and everybody just wanting to do something good, that act itself might also be creating food waste, because without understanding who is consuming it, whether do they cook, if you give them oil and they don't cook, you're actually creating waste. Actually, just to also share, in Singapore, we now have a food work group. We call it a food work group that is actually helmed by the Ministry of Social and Family Development, where food charities, private sector, public sectors, all relating to food, is in a work group, and we are sitting together to really work out, map up some kind of a guideline policies that would be useful in managing food security in Singapore. Food from the Heart is also in another group. We are also looking at enacting the Good Samaritan law, and that will also encourage industries related to food to also donate food instead of binning them. So those are some of the things that are in the pipeline.
Thanks for that. There's a very interesting question. Just when I thought, okay, I was going to slowly start moving towards the end of it, but I'm going to take, Phil, one of your questions, the last one, which is, Singapore is surrounded by poor, largely agrarian societies where farmers are mostly the poorest in their communities. Wouldn't the most sustainable thing for Singapore to do be to invest in long-term cold storage and import food from, example, Indonesia? I have my thoughts on that, but I'll let you guys start first.
Okay, maybe I'll start. I think the impact that Singapore is making on its its demand on food globally is creating environmental challenges in producing countries. For example, in Malaysia and Cameron Highlands, where they're growing Chinese brassicas for 70% majority Chinese population with eating habit of wanting these vegetables that don't grow very traditionally in our tropical environment. This then causes environmental damage, landslides, water table pollution, discharge, which we don't pay the cost for, right? We are then receivers of very cheap produce as well. So there needs to be a true cost accounting of the food, taking into account environmental damage and travel as well. And then that should be returned back to these farming communities to improve their practices so that it becomes more sustainable. I think long-term cold storage, I think Singapore already has a very robust stockpiling strategy where, for example, staples like rice, they have to keep stock for 3-4 months for the entire population before it goes out into the market. So those are already in place. But I think that there needs to be a lot more support for agrarian societies in Southeast Asia. And also leveraging, the knowledge and expertise of indigenous communities in these areas to transfer knowledge back into Singapore so that it helps us design better food systems using crops that are more suited for our climate and our environment.
Anyone else would like to add to that? Thanks, Bjorn. If not, I have a point on that, which is, do you think we are getting more towards nationalism in food, especially after COVID, which is connected to that? The fact that yes, other countries is better for Singapore to spend money and agrarian society help them, but the whole idea of Singapore going 30 by 30 is that we want to be self-sufficient. Whatever happens to the rest of the world, how many years we want to close our borders, we should be able to be self-sustaining. And that's part of the resilience strategy beyond just going outside. But I think, and Helena, do you see that trend in when you look at it globally in terms of nationalism of food?
To be honest, I'm not sure really. I think it's more that trade is always going to be extremely important for food security. We can't get away from that. Even if Singapore goes to the 30 by 30 policy, still 70% needs to be imported. So I think there is a really important role for, you know, regional economies to provide more food as well, which would also have a lower carbon footprint than, you know, food coming across the world. But I think it depends, because actually a lot of, if we look at carbon and the climate change footprint of food, most of the footprint of food is actually in the production rather than how far it's traveled. So just another interesting point to raise. We need to consider a whole life cycle of food if we're going to tackle climate change. And actually trade can be really important to reduce the environmental footprint of food as well, and ensure that people have food when they need it. So I think we're not going to get away from that situation. I think what COVID has more put a focus on intention on is food safety and also pandemic risk. And that's not generally from the importation of food, it's more the production process of food, because factory farmings and all these techniques that we have now, putting livestock in a very small space close together, is a perfect breeding ground for disease. So I think it's put more of a spotlight in that, I would argue.
Thanks, that's a good point. I think with that, I would say we're getting close to the hour. It's absolutely been a fascinating chat in the last 1 hour. It is one of my interests anyway, and a lot of the conversations that we had, this is exactly what we want, is a diversity of thoughts and coming from three very different angles and entry points in this whole food ecosystem conversation. So thank you for that, I would say. Thank you for all the questions. I think that really helped to engage with our panelists, but also with yourselves. So thank you for those questions, and hopefully we managed to answer all of them. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Lorena, if you have a few words to close us down.
Thanks, Chin Tang, and what an amazing event. There's certainly a lot of poignant messages and differences in understanding circularity and what this means from a food resilience point of view. So thank you so much to our speakers or our panelists, Helena, Bjorn and Bihia. Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course to our moderator, Chin Tang. So if we just want to focus on what thank you for what we've got coming on in terms of our chamber events. So what we have coming up is the 5th annual Celebrity Diversity Photography Competition, on the 22nd of June. We also have Scaling Up Investments in Southeast Asia for Sustainable Infrastructure, also in the same week on the 24th of June, with an amazing lineup of panelists there. We also have coming up towards the end of the month, updates in the Singapore Personal Data Protection Act. And of course, in July, we have another webinar orientated around sustainability on green bonds, carbon offsetting, and the challenges with data and transparency. And last but not least, I just want to mention to everybody, following the event, we have a feedback survey, which will be coming to you by email. And we just ask everybody if you could please take the time to fill that in and send that through to us at BritCham. And on that note, I think we'll officially close out the event. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And a final thank you to our speakers for joining us today.